All right. Hey, so yeah, this was a really good intro. He kind of covered all the hot points. Today we're going to be talking about building empathy while building accessible apps. So before we dive in, this is me. I'm a software engineer. I work at Microsoft in Seattle. Back at home, I have this awesome dog in the picture, and I build mechanical keyboards. But day to day, I'm on a team at Microsoft that designs a design system and a component library that's fully accessible out of the box. And our main focus is supporting internal products to build rich, accessible tools and products. So if you want to talk about any of this stuff more, find me during the conference, find me on Twitter. I love talking about accessibility, keyboards, and dogs. But I'm really excited to give this talk today about accessibility because I'm disabled, and I normally don't see talks on accessibility given by someone in the community or with a focus on empathy. I feel like it's something that doesn't really get a whole lot of attention, especially in our industry, which is terrifying because our industry is responsible for building tools and products that everyone across the world is supposed to use, from financing to healthcare, and these are things that everyone needs to be able to do and have access to. So the goal of this talk is to give you guys the knowledge and tools to make your apps more accessible, but I think that understanding why creating accessible products is so important takes empathy. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about that before we dive into some of the more technical stuff. And for the technical parts, I'm going to keep things a bit more high level because there's a lot of content to cover. And I think it's more important for you guys to walk away with a breadth of knowledge that you can then explore more on your own, but at least you know what's out there. So we'll go over what it means to be disabled, what it means to make something accessible, and then we'll take a look at some of the implementation details from a technical perspective. So let's talk about what it means to be disabled. So in my intro, I said that I'm disabled. And when most people think about someone who's disabled, they probably don't think of someone who looks like me. The first image that probably pops into your mind is maybe someone who uses a wheelchair or someone who has a guide dog. But disabled people can look like anyone. And this is kind of like the very legal definition. Being disabled just means you have a physical or mental impairment that limits a major life activity. And if you stop and think about it, that's a really broad statement, and people can be impacted by their disability in completely unique ways. In fact, 90% of disabilities are invisible. These are people like me who might not use a mobility aid, and people who look like they're able-bodied. And, if I wasn't standing here today wearing this hand brace because I had surgery a few weeks ago related to my disability, you probably wouldn't think twice about me. So worldwide, 1 billion people experience some form of disability. That's about 15% of the world's population. So this is not a minority group. This is not, a small percentage of people that they're kind of just like edge cases, right? Because humans aren't edge cases. So what does it mean to be accessible, and what does creating an accessible product actually look like? So there's a couple things that we need to break down when we talk about the intersection between disabilities and accessibility. And everyone's situation is going to look different, but there's kind of 3 main categories that we look at. So first, we have permanent disabilities. These will not change over time, and they are not dependent on an environment or a situation. So an example is maybe a person born without an arm. There's not really anything that they're going to do about that, and it doesn't matter if you're at school, at home, at a football game, you have that disability. And then you have temporary disabilities that will or may change or improve over time, but they're still not dependent on a situation or environment. So an example is me in my hand brace. Typically, I have full use of my hands, but because of this surgery, while I'm recovering, I don't. And then there's this kind of like weird situational category that's not really a disability, but they still need similar accommodations to someone who might be disabled. And an example of that would be a parent carrying a child in one arm. So they are still going to be trying to find ways to interact with your product with only, one hand. And it's important to note too that, you can be in an intersection of these categories. So I have a permanent disability that typically doesn't, involve my hands, but right now I also have a temporary disability where I can't use my hand to do certain things. And then maybe I also get in the car and I'm driving, and now I'm in this situational category where I can't look at my phone to use it, so I might use similar assistive technologies that someone who's vision impaired might use. So in the US, we have something called the Americans with Disabilities Act, and this protects the rights of disabled people and kind of sets guidelines around how public things should be made accessible to this community. You guys might be familiar with this in terms of like wheelchair ramps and like the buttons that you push to automatically open doors. But the ADA also provides protections around web-related accessibility in a lot of ways. So this is some most recent data that I was able to find on web-specific violations of the ADA just in the last several years. So there's this huge spike between 2017 and 2018, and then like the numbers just don't go down. And that's very concerning. And these are just like what's reported legally, right? This is not the full scope of all the ways and apps and products that are inaccessible to people. And as technology grows and affects more and more aspects of people's daily lives, we as engineers and designers and people in the tech space need to do better. We need to create products and websites and experiences that can be used by everyone. And so now you may be thinking, how do I create apps that work for every disability and every assistive technology? Like, this seems really overwhelming. It seems really difficult. And the answer to that is you really don't. Most assistive technology is meant to do the heavy lifting for you. So there are a lot of users who probably won't interact with your product with traditional input devices like a mouse or touch screen. And they'll use some assistive technology to do that navigation. And as long as you're writing your product in a semantic way, the application that they're using is going to be able to do all that translating. You won't have to do anything special on your end. So the main thing is that we need to follow the coding conventions as developers for whatever language or framework or tool that we're working in. So specifically when we talk about like being web developers or mobile developers, we need to be using HTML semantically, using the right components for the ways that they were designed to be used. And of course, you always want to start with design, and I have a whole set of slides that I'm not going to go over because this is not like a design-focused talk, but you guys can read through it when I upload my slides on my GitHub. So assuming that our designers are on top of their accessibility game and they've built this great visually accessible app, doesn't mean that the app is functionally accessible. Kind of like what we talked about before, we need to make sure that we're building it in a way that the assistive technology will be able to parse through our DOM and know exactly the functionality and the context that this app is being used in. So when we talk about writing semantic HTML, a lot of times I'll see something like this, where we just use divs and spans all willy-nilly, and no one really cares what we're using. We have a bunch of classes, and just by looking at this, I have no idea what this app does. I have no idea what the hierarchy is. What does clicking this div do? We don't know, and if we don't know, the assistive technology tools aren't going to know either. But we can just as easily rewrite this into a very semantic HTML app where we have headers, we have paragraphs, we're using good hierarchy, we are using a link with very descriptive text where it says, visit my website, and I know that I will be able to click this, and I know exactly what it does. So I'm kind of going to like take a step back and highlight the major pain points that I usually see when dealing with accessibility issues at work. And hopefully this will kind of be like a general high-level view that you guys can take away and be like, I'm going to do some self-reflection, and I'm going to look through my code and make sure that it's all following these conventions. So the first big thing is alt text. So alt text, there's a lot of times users who are visually impaired or users who might disable downloading images to save bandwidth. And they need to be able to understand the image and the context that that image is being used in. So if this didn't have an alt text, the screen reader might say just dog.jpg, which means absolutely nothing to someone who's visually impaired using the website. So we need to make sure that our text is functional. It provides all of the same context that a sighted user would get from this image in that context. And the important thing here is that every image needs an alt tag, but kind of like the asterisk is that the alt tag can be an empty string if it's appropriate. If this is like a purely decorative image that doesn't matter whether or not it's there, doesn't provide any additional context, it's just there to be pretty, we can add an empty string. But the main focus is on making the alt text functional. So imagine you have a painting of a flower on your website, and your website is this like cool biology about like the anatomy of plants. Your alt text is probably going to want to focus on the different parts of the flower and the different like anatomy that you're looking at. I don't know anything about flowers. But if your page is about painting techniques, then instead your alt text should focus on maybe the colors or the techniques and the paints being used. So it's all very context dependent. The next big thing is using headings. You want to make sure that your users are able to quickly navigate a lot of content for like very data-heavy pages. And headings give you a great way as a keyboarding or a screen reader user to quickly jump from section to section. And they also help you contextually organize information on a page. So you want to make sure that heading levels are hierarchical. Every page should have at least one heading to kind of anchor the user to like what the context of that page is. Every text that looks like a heading should be a heading. Don't just use spans and styling. And then kind of on the flip side for that, don't use headings just for the styling or sizing because you don't want to write CSS. Just write CSS, guys. It'll be fine. You'll survive. And then this is just like a quick reference. If you ever want to like have that real hands-on experience for what your user's experience is going to be like using a screen reader or assistive technology, like this is the shortcuts for Mac and Windows. And I think that's like a very powerful way to build that empathy, because you don't know the kind of like really crappy experience you might be giving your users unintentionally until you go and you use these yourself. And then my favorite topic is links versus buttons. So like technically they can perform similar types of actions, right? Like in HTML, you can just give anything an on-click and it will do something. But you have to be very intentional and very careful about when you choose to use links versus buttons, because it does change the context that assistive technology tools will kind of like give to users. So please use links when you're navigating somewhere. This might be to another page on your website. It might be to an external page, anchors within that same page. And then use buttons when you're performing an action on the same page, maybe like deleting an item or creating a new item, but don't perform page navigations with on-click. And a lot of times I'll hear that I don't like how links look and I don't like how buttons look. I'm just going to use whatever the heck I want, and usually it's a div with an on-click. And that's terrible. Please don't do that. just use semantic HTML and use CSS, and your code will immediately be more accessible without you having to do a whole lot else on top of it. And kind of like if you see the theme of context, because a lot of times, you'll have visually impaired users who they just can't make these visual connections that we can make by looking at our page. We need to make sure that all of the links that we are giving have the context for what they are linking out to, or the buttons, what kind of like click action is happening. So if you think that, you can't make your link short enough without it being like this really visually distracting, like paragraph of underlined link situation, that's okay. There's this like really popular thing in the accessibility world called this visually hidden class. And I have a code on the next slide from the Ally project. And you can add visually hidden stuff into your DOM, and assistive technology tools will still pick up on that information because it exists within the DOM, but you can hide that visually for your sighted users. And so this is just like the snippet. Always got to make sure that we're supporting IE 6 and 7. But this is like just a really handy little tool to keep around. And then kind of like the quick way to spot if you're using links properly or not is to look for any link tag with an empty href and then something in the on-click. That's like the big red flag that you need to go and fix this. Maybe it needs to be a button. Maybe you can actually give this a URL to navigate to. The asterisk is that it's okay to have on-click handlers in links. Usually that's used for things like telemetry and logging if you want to keep track of like how many users have clicked this link, but it should never be tied to functionality that's directly going to impact users. If you're using a link, it still needs to have some href value. So you followed all the semantic HTML rules. You're like setting yourself up for success, for accessibility. Everything's looking good. So now you have to actually sit down and start testing your app. And the main things you normally want to focus on when testing are keyboard navigation and screen readers. So when we look at keyboard navigation, we want to make sure that keyboard focus is always visible. Keyboard focus needs to follow a logical order, and that might vary app to app, but typically, you want it to be top to bottom, left to right for in a language like English, and then making sure that you're following the language conventions. So like if your app is in Hebrew, you want to make sure that you're doing right to left. And then another important thing is that you need to make sure that you're able to tab into and away from all interactive elements. So a lot of times if you are setting focus manually, you can get into weird situations where basically you get into this focus trap where you try to like tab away from something and then that element keeps pulling focus back onto itself. And that basically means that your entire app is inaccessible to keyboard users. And there's also like this whole separate category of like power users like myself who just tab around through stuff. Even though I can use a mouse, I choose not to. And so you basically are making your website unusable for a lot of people. So that's a big thing to look out for. So the best way I found to test this is click in the address bar, set your mouse aside, and only use your keyboard to navigate. So you'll start tabbing, and you can see in this GIF here, you have the visual focus moving across all of the navigational items on Twitter. You see like the little bubble around it, and you're able to shift tab to walk backwards through your app. And you just want to make sure that all interactive elements on your page are getting focus in a logical order. If at any point you don't see a particular interactive element getting focus, you're probably doing an outline 0 or none somewhere in your code, and that's a big red flag. if it's not accompanied by an alternative like a box shadow or something like that. A lot of times people will opt to hide the native outline and put their own box shadow to like make the style follow their theme or their like product branding. And that's totally fine. You just need to have some visual reference of where you are on the page. So all this may seem like a lot, but if you have a solid design that's thought about accessibility from a visual standpoint, and then as a developer, if you're following the proper semantic rules of whatever language you're coding in, you should be most of the way there. And usually, like, there's no substitute for hands-on accessibility testing, and it can be very difficult to understand how a visually impaired user might effectively use a screen reader if you're someone who's sighted or things like that. But I'm a big advocate for like trying it out yourself and seeing how the experience feels. But there's also really great tools that can help you get like a general idea of the accessibility health of your product. So this is the tool that I use pretty much every day at work. It's called Accessibility Insights. It's built by Microsoft. This is the web extension, but they also have desktop and mobile versions. And so this is a fast pass that I did of some crappy website. And it gives you a detailed list of all of the accessibility failures, which accessibility rules they're breaking, and then if you expand each of the categories, it will tell you exactly where in the DOM the accessibility error is happening, and it'll give you suggestions on how to fix it. So this is a great way if you're still new to accessibility and still learning, you know, what are all the different areas that I have to make sure are working. This is a great tool to kind of like semi-automated be able to tell what errors you have. So HTML and CSS, like they're designed to help you write great and powerful and accessible tools, but we have to make sure we're doing our job and using the language properly. And when we use it properly, this can be a very low effort situation. But low effort doesn't mean zero effort. We have to start building accessible products from the design process before we even think about coding. And when we don't, and we don't prioritize accessibility in our products, we're taking away the agency of disabled users. One of my coworkers is deaf, and his biggest issue at work is that he doesn't have the agency to speak up for himself in meetings, and he relies on his interpreters. And a lot of the tools and technologies that are available for deaf users today just don't give him the agency to speak up for himself and for his decisions in our product making. So our lives as designers and developers and engineers have been made so much easier with all of the tools that we have at our disposal for making sure that we're building things in accessible ways. So really it's just about building our empathy for the disabled community so that we're striving every day to build products that reach these accessibility standards. So with that, I highly encourage you to take a look at the full slide deck that covers a bunch of accessibility design principles as well. I'll tweet out a link to it. My Twitter handle is on the bottom of the slides, Isabela Seymour. And the last slide of this presentation, I'll flash it for a quick second, is just like a bunch of links to resources. So like everyone get your phones ready. So this is just like a semi-extensive list of all of the resources and tools and websites, both for design and engineering, to really help you as you work on making your products more accessible. And I will just leave this up, and that's the end of my talk.